What would you do if the person in handcuffs was one of the most powerful voices for justice in the country? On a quiet evening in a bustling American city, a black man dressed in a simple white shirt is walking home after a long day. He is respected, accomplished, and holds a position many would never dare to dream of. But as the city lights flicker and people hurry past, no one knows that beneath this calm surface, a storm is about to break, one that will shatter reputations and spark a nationwide conversation on power, race, and justice. Moments later, police cars pull up to the curb, their lights painting the sidewalk in red and blue. Officers step out, eyes fixed on him, suspicion already clouding their judgment. Within seconds they approach, demanding identification, voices tense and commanding. The man tries to remain calm, but he can feel the weight of their gaze, the centuries of history pressing down on this very moment. He reaches for his wallet. The officer's hands move faster, grabbing his arm, snapping cold metal cuffs around his wrists. The world seems to stop. He is pushed toward the waiting car, his dignity stripped away in full view of strangers with cell phones ready. Who is this man? What crime did he commit? As murmurs ripple through the crowd, the officer's actions are swift, unyielding, and above all, public. But beneath the surface, a deeper injustice is unfolding, one that exposes a painful truth about how Black Americans are still seen, no matter their status or achievements. This is not just a story about a mistaken identity. This is a story about the invisible walls of discrimination, the trauma of being reduced to a stereotype, and the danger of unchecked authority. Because within 5 minutes everything will change, not just for the man in the white shirt, but for the officers whose careers will never be the same. Have you ever wondered how quickly things can spiral out of control when bias goes unchallenged, or how power can be weaponized in a split second, regardless of someone's background or accomplishments? What happened on that street corner will echo far beyond that night, raising questions we all need to face about justice, about dignity, and about who gets to be safe in America. If this story makes you feel something, I invite you to support this conversation. Like this video if you believe justice should be blind. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something that changed how you see the world? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because together our voices can make sure stories like this are never ignored. On that night, what should have been an ordinary walk home became an extraordinary turning point in American history. The black man in handcuffs was not a suspect, not a criminal, and not someone to be feared. He was a federal judge, one of the youngest ever appointed, a symbol of what is possible when barriers are broken and the promise of justice becomes real for everyone. But for the police officers who stopped him, none of that mattered in those first critical moments. They saw only what centuries of prejudice had taught them to see. As he stood against the cold steel of the police car, confusion and disbelief swept over him. He had spent his entire career defending the rights of others, fighting for a system that too often failed to protect people who looked like him. Now he was the one being treated like a suspect, surrounded by flashing lights and the stares of passers-by who had no idea who he really was. The officers, fueled by routine and assumption, questioned him aggressively. Their voices were sharp, each demand echoing with an undercurrent of suspicion. "What are you doing here? Do you have any weapons? Where are you going?" Every answer he gave was met with skepticism, as if his very presence on that sidewalk required justification. The judge remained composed, his training kicking in, but inside he was torn. He knew the law, he knew his rights, and yet he also knew that pushing back too hard could escalate things dangerously fast. People around started to film. Some whispered, others stared. A few tried to intervene, but most were silent, watching an all-too-familiar scene unfold. The judge could feel the humiliation burning in his chest, the knowledge that his achievements, his years of service, meant nothing in that moment. To the world, he was just another black man being arrested in public. The officers did not recognize him. They saw only the surface, his skin color, his posture, the time of night. They did not see the countless hours he had spent in courtrooms upholding the Constitution, nor the lives he had changed with his rulings. They did not know that their actions, captured on camera, would soon ignite a firestorm that neither of them could contain. As they tightened the cuffs, the judge's mind raced. He thought of his family, his colleagues, and the young people who looked up to him as proof that success was possible. He wondered what message this scene would send to anyone who saw it. Would it fuel more fear, more anger, more resignation? Or would it finally force people to confront the realities of discrimination in America? The city buzzed around them, unaware that history was being written on that sidewalk. In those 5 minutes, the fragile line between power and vulnerability was exposed for all to see, a lesson in how quickly justice can be turned upside down and how much work there still is to do. It was only after those tense, drawn-out minutes that the truth finally broke through the confusion. As the officers began processing the man they had just handcuffed, one of them asked again for his identification. With trembling hands, partly from anger, partly from humiliation, the judge produced his wallet, and with it, his federal identification card. There, unmistakable and official, were the words that should have changed everything: United States Federal Judge. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. The officers stared at the badge, then back at the man they had just treated like a common criminal. Shock flickered across their faces, quickly replaced by a deep, unmistakable discomfort. The atmosphere shifted from one of authority and accusation to awkward disbelief. Passers-by, still filming and whispering, sensed that something extraordinary was happening. Word began to spread. This was not an ordinary arrest. This was a colossal mistake. The officers' demeanor changed instantly. Their voices, which just moments before had been sharp and commanding, now stumbled and softened. Apologies spilled out, forced and nervous. But the damage was already done. The cuffs had left their mark, both physically and emotionally. The judge, still processing the surreal turn of events, stood silently as the officers fumbled for words, struggling to explain themselves, to justify what had just occurred. One officer tried to lighten the tension, insisting it was a routine stop, that they were just doing their jobs. But no explanation could erase the memory of those 5 minutes. The suspicion, the humiliation, the sense that dignity could be so easily taken away, regardless of title or achievement. The cameras caught everything. The transition from harsh authority to awkward apology, from unchecked power to desperate backpedaling. News of the incident began to spread like wildfire, first among those present, then across social media, and eventually to national news outlets. The question on everyone's lips was simple yet profound. If this could happen to a federal judge, what hope was there for ordinary black Americans? The revelation of the judge's identity did not just shame the officers. It forced an entire system to look itself in the mirror. It exposed the fragile difference between respect and suspicion, how quickly one can flip into the other, based solely on appearance. The judge, standing in the middle of the chaos, felt a complex swirl of emotions: vindication, outrage, deep sorrow. He knew that what happened to him was not unique. The only difference was that this time it was impossible to ignore. The crowd, sensing the gravity of what had just unfolded, began to press for accountability, for answers, for real change. The officers, suddenly aware of the magnitude of their mistake, were left standing in the same street. But now, everything about their world had shifted. In that moment, the story moved beyond a simple encounter. It became a national conversation, a flashpoint for rage, for empathy, and for the demand that true justice means never assuming, never profiling, and never forgetting the humanity behind every face. As the judge's identity rippled through the crowd and into the police radios, a deeper investigation into the officers themselves began almost immediately. Journalists and activists, fueled by outrage and curiosity, started to dig into their backgrounds. What emerged was a troubling pattern that could no longer be ignored. These were not rookies making a naive mistake. They were seasoned officers, with years of service behind them. Yet their personnel files painted a portrait of men who had repeatedly walked the thin, often invisible line between authority and abuse. Complaints had followed these officers for years, some formal, others whispered in the halls of the precinct, and more still posted in late-night threads by community members who felt powerless. Instances of excessive force, profiling during traffic stops, and harsh language aimed disproportionately at people of color were all there, just beneath the surface of their carefully constructed public images. Many of these complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings, chalked up to the stressful realities of law enforcement. But as details of the judge's ordeal came to light, those explanations began to sound hollow. For the first time, the stories that had lived in the shadows came into the light. Black residents who had once feared retaliation now spoke openly about their own encounters. Old wounds reopened as families recalled loved ones who had faced similar humiliation and fear. In community meetings and on social media, a picture of systemic failure started to emerge, with these two officers at its center. Local activists quickly connected the judge's experience to the broader context of racial profiling and police misconduct. Their research revealed that the officers had each received multiple warnings in the past, not only for their approach to policing, but for their attitudes during de-escalation training and community engagement. Despite these red flags, they had continued to serve, trusted with the power to make decisions that could upend lives in seconds. As the scrutiny intensified, the police department found itself on the defensive. Officials promised transparency, but the community's trust had been fractured too many times before. Outside the station, protesters gathered, holding signs demanding accountability and chanting the judge's name alongside so many others. News vans lined the block. National figures began to weigh in, asking how a profession tasked with protecting justice could allow patterns like this to go unchecked. Inside their homes, the officers faced consequences of a different kind. Their families received angry calls and messages. Friends grew distant. The story, now national, was impossible to escape. Each detail revealed in the media drove home the reality that their actions on that night were not an isolated error, but the result of a long history of choices now exposed for all to see. By now, the officers were no longer just symbols of authority. They had become the face of a system under fire, caught in a storm that demanded answers about more than just a single incident. Their pasts, once protected by silence, were now public record, raising the question, how many more stories like this have gone unheard? As the story of the judge's handcuffing and the officer's troubling history exploded in the media, its impact within the black community was immediate and profound. News traveled fast, not just through traditional headlines but across group chats, church gatherings, neighborhood meetings, and social media feeds. For many, this incident struck a nerve that was both personal and generational. It was not simply another headline. It was a mirror reflecting the deep wounds and everyday anxieties of being black in America, even at the highest levels of accomplishment. Parents sat down with their children to have difficult, necessary conversations. Again, they explained, sometimes with trembling voices, that respectability, education, and even high status could not always shield them from suspicion or humiliation. Young people filled with ambition felt a fresh wave of fear and anger. If a federal judge, someone who had climbed every rung society promised would bring security, could be treated like a criminal in plain sight, what hope was there for everyone else? The story shattered illusions and reignited the ache of countless past injustices, from schoolyard harassment to wrongful arrests that never made the news. Community leaders organized emergency town halls, inviting people to share their pain, anger, and ideas for action. In barbershops and beauty salons, the judge's name became a symbol, a shorthand for the larger struggle for dignity and safety. The collective response was not just outrage, but a determination to turn pain into power. Grassroots organizations mobilized to support the judge and his family, but also to demand long overdue reforms. There was talk of new community oversight boards, renewed calls for body cameras, and urgent pressure on local politicians to address policing policies that had failed so many for so long. But the emotional toll ran deeper than activism alone. In private moments, elders wept for the dreams they had passed down, now threatened by a reality that seemed unchanged. College students debated whether to pursue careers in law, wondering if the promise of justice was worth the constant threat of being dehumanized. Artists and poets responded with raw, honest works, some shared on street corners, others on viral posts, turning collective trauma into art that demanded to be seen and heard. The story also revealed the resilience and solidarity of the black community. In the face of pain, there was also pride. Pride in the judge's strength, pride in the community's refusal to stay silent. Messages of support flooded his inbox from all corners of the country, from people he had never met, from former clients, from old teachers, and from strangers who recognized themselves in his struggle. Each message was a reminder that, despite everything, hope remained a powerful force. As the days passed, the story became not just about what had happened, but what would happen next. Would this pain finally lead to change, or would it become just another scar on a long, painful timeline? In every conversation, every gathering, and every silent moment of reflection, the question lingered: if even a judge could be humiliated this way, what would it take for justice to truly belong to everyone? The reverberations of the judge's ordeal reached the highest levels of the legal system, with unprecedented speed. Within hours, the local courthouse was abuzz, not with ordinary legal proceedings, but with heated discussions about the meaning and consequence of what had just unfolded. Judges, attorneys, and legal clerks, all accustomed to the rituals of justice, found themselves confronting a crisis that struck at the heart of their profession. The story was no longer just about one man. It was a reckoning for an entire system that prided itself on fairness, but had once again fallen short. The first public statement came from the presiding judge of the district, whose carefully chosen words echoed across the courtroom and soon appeared in every news feed. He called for an independent investigation and reaffirmed the court's commitment to equality under the law. Yet for many watching, these assurances felt painfully insufficient. They had heard them before, after every headline-grabbing incident that faded into obscurity as soon as outrage waned. National legal associations weighed in, some with statements of solidarity, others with thinly veiled frustration at the slow pace of reform. The American Bar Association released a formal condemnation of racial profiling and urged every legal professional in the country to reflect on the ways bias shapes their work. High-profile lawyers, many of whom had fought for decades to diversify the bench and make justice more accessible, spoke out in interviews, sharing personal stories that mirrored the judge's experience. For some, the judge's humiliation brought back memories of their own battles, with prejudice in law school, with discrimination in hiring, with the quiet, persistent doubts that shadowed every step of their careers. Meanwhile, the case attracted massive media attention. News networks devoted special segments to the judge's biography, his judicial record, and the broader problem of racial profiling in law enforcement. Opinion writers and talk show hosts debated the responsibilities of police, the culture within departments, and the limits of current reforms. The spotlight was relentless, making it impossible for officials to sweep the incident aside. But perhaps the most significant response came from within the system itself. Younger legal professionals, interns, and law students, many of them people of color, saw in the judge's story both a warning and a call to action. They began to organize, pushing their mentors and professors to address these issues in real terms, not just as case studies but as urgent, lived realities. Workshops were convened, seminars held, and proposals drafted. Reform was no longer an abstract goal. It was a demand rooted in lived experience. As the pressure mounted, the police department found itself under investigation from multiple directions. City officials, civil rights organizations, and federal agencies all announced inquiries into their practices. Every day, new details emerged, painting a picture of a culture in need of transformation. Some officials defended their colleagues, while others distanced themselves, eager to show that they stood on the side of justice. In the midst of this storm, the judge kept his public statements brief but powerful. He thanked those who had supported him, insisted that the focus remain on broader systemic issues, and called for dignity, compassion, and true accountability, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever suffered in silence. The fall from authority to infamy was swift and merciless. Within just days of the incident, the two police officers at the center of the scandal saw their careers begin to unravel. The footage of them handcuffing a federal judge, a black man who posed no threat and had committed no crime, was everywhere. From primetime news to viral Twitter threads and Instagram reels, their faces became symbols of systemic injustice, shared and scrutinized by millions. Initially, the police department tried to control the damage with carefully worded statements, emphasizing protocol and downplaying intent. But the public was no longer interested in excuses. The damage wasn't just reputational, it was institutional. City officials responding to the overwhelming backlash placed both officers on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. This was not business as usual. This was political survival. Internal affairs moved quickly. Past complaints that had been quietly dismissed were reopened. Old body camera footage was re-examined. Witnesses who had previously been ignored were now considered credible. As the web of past misconduct was pulled apart, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. It was the product of years of unchecked power, and this time the mistake was made in front of a man with both the legal expertise and the public platform to demand consequences. The officers, once confident in their authority, now found themselves surrounded by silence. Colleagues kept their distance. Union support, usually automatic, was tentative at best. They had become liabilities. The communities they once patrolled viewed them with open disdain. Their names were chanted in protest marches and printed on placards demanding justice. not for a single moment, but for an entire system that allowed those moments to happen. The department's leadership, under intense scrutiny, had little choice. A week later, the announcement came. Both officers had been terminated from their positions, pending further legal review. The response was met with a mix of relief and anger. Relief that for once consequences were visible. Anger that it had taken someone with power, a judge, for those consequences to occur at all. But the fallout didn't end there. The officers became the subject of civil suits filed by the judge and supported by major civil rights organizations. Legal scholars called it a landmark case, one that could redefine accountability standards for law enforcement. Interviews with their former colleagues painted a troubling picture of entitlement and impunity, of warning signs ignored in the name of departmental loyalty. In their personal lives, the collapse was equally brutal. Friends and family were harassed online. Their homes were targeted by protesters, media vans parked outside their driveways. One officer reportedly tried to issue a public apology, but it was seen as too little, too late. Words from a man who had never paused to listen until it was his own future on the line. Ironically, the very legal system they had once served would now determine their fate, not from behind a badge but in front of a bench. And in a twist of poetic justice, many wondered if the judge they once humiliated might one day preside over the legal consequences of their actions. Careers that had taken decades to build unraveled in days. But for those watching, especially in the black community, the real message was not just about punishment, it was about precedent. It was about drawing a line in the sand. It was about proving, even just once, that power doesn't always protect you when the truth is too loud to silence. In the days that followed, as media frenzy began to settle and official investigations continued, the judge finally found a quiet moment to reflect. Away from the press conferences, the courtroom, and the flash of cameras, he sat alone, replaying every second of that night. Not just the handcuffs, not just the shock, but the feeling that in one fleeting moment everything he had built could be reduced to skin color and suspicion. He had spent his life defying expectations. Raised by a single mother in a modest neighborhood, he knew early on that the path would be uphill. He excelled in school, often the only black student in advanced classes. He went to law school on scholarship, graduated top of his class, and rose through the ranks with a fierce commitment to justice. He had mentored young lawyers, spoken at high schools, and never forgot the faces of boys who looked at him and saw possibility. And yet none of that stopped him from being thrown against a car like he didn't belong. As he sat with those thoughts, a different kind of anger took hold. Deeper, quieter, but far more enduring. It wasn't just about those officers. It was about the lie so many are forced to believe, that if you work hard enough, play by the rules, achieve greatness, you'll be safe. But safety, he now realized with brutal clarity, was never promised, not to people who looked like him. He thought about his mother, how she used to tell him to keep his hands visible during traffic stops, how she would stay up late worrying when he walked home from study groups. He remembered the look in her eyes when he first told her he'd been nominated as a federal judge, a look of pride but also relief, as if maybe, just maybe, he had made it far enough to be untouchable. That illusion was now shattered. Still, despite the pain, he refused to be broken. He refused to let humiliation silence him. Instead, he did what he had always done. He turned toward purpose. He spoke to law students again, but this time with a different edge in his voice. He talked about trauma, about dignity, about what the law should protect, but too often does not. He called for reform not just in policies, but in culture, in the very assumptions that shape how justice is imagined and applied. In interviews, he chose his words carefully. He didn't want to be cast as a victim. He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was determined to make this moment matter, to ensure that the next black child who dreams of becoming a judge doesn't grow up believing that a badge and a robe are still not enough. He also found strength in those who stood with him, judges of every background, young activists on the front lines, elders who had marched long before him. Their solidarity reminded him that while the system had failed that night, the people had not. And that solidarity, that resistance, became a shield stronger than any title. His dignity, he realized, wasn't something that could be taken in 5 minutes. It was built over a lifetime, through struggle and clarity of purpose. And now, more than ever, he was committed to using that dignity as a weapon, not of revenge but of justice. The aftermath of the incident did not fade quietly into the backdrop of the news cycle. It erupted into something far more lasting. The story of a black federal judge being handcuffed on the street had already ignited national outrage, but what followed was a cascade of responses that reached beyond public statements and symbolic gestures. In cities across the country, calls for systemic reform gained new momentum, fueled by the undeniable clarity of this moment. In Washington, D.C., members of Congress referenced the case during heated debates over police accountability legislation. Civil rights leaders, some of whom had long fought for incremental change, saw in this case the kind of emotional urgency that could finally tip the scale. The judge's experience became a focal point in public hearings, with lawmakers citing it as evidence of the urgent need for training, transparency, and independent oversight of law enforcement. In universities and law schools, curricula were revised almost overnight. Professors included the case in ethics classes, and discussions about implicit bias were no longer abstract. They were tied directly to the reality that status and achievement cannot shield someone from racism. Student groups organized forums, and for many young legal minds, the judge's story became a reason to stay in the fight, not to run from a broken system, but to become the ones who change it. Police departments across the country were forced to respond. Some proactively initiated internal reviews, worried they could be next. Others, under pressure from city officials and community leaders, finally implemented reforms that had long been stalled, mandating de-escalation training, introducing community review boards, and even revising hiring protocols to better screen for racial bias. The change wasn't universal, and resistance remained. But the fear of public backlash and the undeniable visibility of what had happened pushed the needle in ways rarely seen before. More importantly, the case inspired conversations at kitchen tables, workplaces, and neighborhood centers. Black families who had grown used to suppressing their fears now spoke openly about them. White allies who had once remained silent began asking harder questions of their police departments, of their communities, and of themselves. For many, the judge's story was a turning point that could no longer be explained away by a few bad apples. It became proof of a pattern, of a deeply rooted cultural flaw in how power is applied and how suspicion is weaponized. Even within the judiciary, quiet transformations began to take place. Judges who had once distanced themselves from activism began to speak up. Some wore black armbands in court. Others authored legal opinions that included references to the systemic discrimination laid bare by the case. Behind closed doors, conversations that had once been uncomfortable were now urgent. The judge himself continued to speak, but now as more than a symbol. He met with lawmakers, community organizers, and law enforcement leaders. He demanded not just justice for himself, but measurable change that would prevent the same thing from happening again. And he listened deeply to the stories of those who had experienced worse and for whom there had never been a camera, a headline, or a public outcry. The ripple effect was undeniable. What began as an act of humiliation turned into a rallying cry for truth. And while one case could not erase centuries of injustice, it served as a crack in the wall, one that let light in, one that showed the world that the system could be held accountable when the right people dared to confront it. In the quiet that followed the public outcry, once the protests had thinned and the headlines had shifted to other stories, a deeper, more unsettling question remained, one that echoed not only in the halls of justice, but in the hearts of millions. How many more times will this happen before something truly changes? The judge returned to his courtroom, the same bench, the same robe, the same ritual of justice playing out each day, but nothing felt the same. The weight of what had occurred lingered, not just as a personal scar, but as a haunting reminder of a nation still at war with its own promise of equality. Every defendant who stood before him now reminded him of that night. Every case involving police testimony held a new tension. And every time he looked out at the rows of people watching, he wondered how many of them carried similar wounds, unseen, unspoken, unacknowledged. The public, too, was left with a choice. For some, the story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the badge does not always protect the innocent, and that power must be scrutinized, not just respected. For others, it was a fleeting outrage, absorbed into the endless scroll of injustice. But for those who truly felt it, who saw themselves or their loved ones in that moment of wrongful arrest, it changed something fundamental. It broke whatever illusion remained that merit could shield you from bias, or that justice could exist without accountability. The officers, now unemployed and facing potential legal action, had become cautionary figures in their own right. But even their downfall did not offer closure, because justice in this case, if it could even be called that, was reactive, not preventive. The system had responded only after the error was exposed. The real question, the one that stuck in the judge's throat and burned in the community's soul, was, what happens when there are no cameras, when the victim has no badge or title, when silence replaces outrage? For the next generation, the message was complicated. On one hand, the judge stood as proof of how far one could rise through excellence and perseverance. On the other, his story was a warning that even the highest seat of justice could not guarantee safety in a system blind not just to race, but to its own failures. Teachers used his story to provoke debate. Parents used it to teach caution. Activists used it to demand change. And still, the question lingered. In private, the judge wrestled with that same question. Until when? Until when would dignity be conditional? Until when would fear walk alongside success? Until when would blackness be a reason to justify suspicion, no matter the context? But in that question, he also found clarity, because asking until when wasn't an act of despair. It was a challenge, a declaration that the fight must continue, that silence is no longer an option, that justice must evolve, not just in statutes and training manuals, but in the hearts and minds of every person who holds power over another. So as the world moved on, as it always does, one story remained, a story that was not just about a mistake, or even about a reckoning, but about a nation standing at a moral crossroads, one where the path forward depends not on a judge's title or an officer's badge, but on the courage of everyone watching to ask, what kind of country do we want to be? If you've made it this far, it means this story touched something inside you. Maybe it made you angry. Maybe it made you reflect. Maybe it reminded you of your own experience or someone you love. That alone shows how powerful stories like this are and how urgently we need to keep telling them. So if this message resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, not just for the algorithm, but to show the world that this matters. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever felt judged before anyone knew who you were? Or simply write, I see the truth. Let's fill this space with voices that refuse to be silenced. Subscribe to the channel if you believe that justice must be for everyone, and that stories like this deserve to be heard, shared, and remembered. And don't leave just yet. There's another video waiting on your screen right now that you need to see. Watch it next and keep this conversation alive.